Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's program featuring a conversation between two wonderful members of the Stern community, Ron Blaylock and Aswath Damodaran. Ron is a 1989 alumnus of Stern from the MBA program. He is the founder and managing partner of GenX 360 Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm focused on investing in industrial and business services companies in the US middle market. Prior to launching GenX 360, Ron founded and managed Blaylock and Company, an investment banking firm. Ron has held senior management positions at UBS, Payne Weber Group, and Citicorp, and he serves as a board member at numerous organizations, including Pfizer, CarMax, Urban One, the W.R. Berkeley Corporation, Carnegie Hall, and the one of which he and we are proudest, NYU Stern's executive board. Ron has actually, you can't make out from the virtual background that you will see, but Ron has actually driven up a mountain in where he is to be able to participate in today's show so that he has better internet connectivity because of weather issues where he is right now. Thank you very much, Ron, for that. Joining Ron today is Professor Aswath Damodaran, and Aswath requires no introduction to Stern alumni. But as a professor, you give a professor a microphone, he will hold forth. So I'm going to hold forth anyway. I'm going to introduce him. Aswath holds the Kirshner Family Chair in Finance Education at Stern. He has taught corporate finance and valuation to Stern graduate students and more recently undergraduates for 35 years now. Aswath received his undergraduate degree in commerce from Madras University, and he holds two MBAs, one from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, the other from UCLA, where he also received his PhD in 1985. Aswath's contributions to the field of finance have been recognized in many different ways. He has been the recipient of a number of fellowships, teaching excellent awards, and the Richard Rosenthal Award for Innovation in Investment Management and Corporate Finance. Aswath's skill and enthusiasm in the classroom are absolutely the stuff of legend. He has been voted Professor of the Year by the graduating MBA class 5 times during his career at NYU. A colleague of mine once described him as the best classroom professor of finance in the world. And indeed, it's hard to imagine anyone better. In addition to being widely published in academic journals, Aswath is also the author of several highly regarded and widely used academic texts on valuation, corporate finance, and investment management. Please join me in welcoming Ron and Aswath to the virtual stage. But before I hand it over to them, just a little bit of housekeeping. Ron and Aswath will be in conversation on a range of topics for the first 40 minutes, and then we'll be opening it up to questions from all of you who are tuning in. Please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A chat feature on your screen. We are recording the session along with every single reunion session, and we'll plan to make all the sessions available to you over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you again for joining us. Ron, please take it away.
Thank you, Raghu, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you for your wonderful, inspiring, and excellent leadership of Stern and continuing to grow us and have an outstanding trajectory for growth and accomplishment. So thank you so much, Raghu. And Professor Damodaran, I'm pleased and honored to be, in this discussion with you. And just wanted to open it up a couple of questions regarding the Fed and interest rates. You've spoken about it's okay to raise rates if you think growth will be continuing in a high growth level. It's okay to rise rates. So just that discussion around the Fed and inflation would be helpful, Professor Damodaran.
I'm glad to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to students from past years. I'm not sure what a virtual reunion. It's like a virtual bar, I guess. It's not quite the same thing as being together in a room, but it's better to be together, at least virtually. Now, on Fed and interest rates, one of the things that I think has troubled me the most in the last 12 years is this delusion that the Fed actually sets rates. It's a delusion that's fed into by CNBC, by writers who act as if Jerome Powell is the supreme dignitary who can raise rates and lower rates. Now, I tell people a story about how I took my, but 7 or 8 years ago, where I took my daughter and my son and my wife to the Federal Reserve for a tour. You can go downtown, and it's a great tour. They actually take you around the building, and the best part of the tour is they take you down to the basement to the mint, and you can see all these stacks of currency. I almost made myself persona non grata right off the top, because we walked in for the tour, and this 22-year-old nice person comes up. She's going to lead the tour. And I almost asked the question, can you take me to the interest rate room? Because in my visions of what CNBC was telling me, there must be a room where at that time, Ben Bernanke would go in and he'd raise T-bond rates and he'd lower T-bill rates. Let's start with the reality check. The Fed sets only one rate, the Fed funds rate. I don't think anybody in this audience has ever borrowed or lent at the Fed funds rate because it's an overnight bank borrowing rate. The only rate it sets. So does it influence other rates? Yes. But it's through the powers. Now, I describe the Fed as the Wizard of Oz. Its power comes from the perception that it has power. So the signals that it sends are read by the market and can affect rates, but mostly at the short end of the spectrum. So what drives rates? Very simply, inflation and real growth. If your inflation rate is 5%, your real growth is 6%, I don't care what the Fed wants to do, your rates are going to be double-digit rates. So one of the things I think we're going to wrestle with all year this year is if as people are expecting, the economy comes back strongly and inflation comes back with that. And that's not, it's a clearly plausible scenario. There is nothing the Fed can do to keep rates from rising. All the Fed can do is try to get ahead of the game and act like they're raising rates. So if I were Jerome Powell, here's what I would do. I would start raising rates in about 2 weeks. And then when rates go up, act like I did it. And I get a lot of bad press, but it'll preserve the delusion that actually the Fed was the one that raised rates. So I think if you're an investor, stop looking at the Fed. Start thinking about inflation and real growth, because that's where interest rate changes are going to come from.
No. Excellent. So moving from the Fed to another topic of always current on your mind, and you discussed it a lot, is Tesla and that valuation, and how one could look at Tesla at this point in the market with infrastructure, EV, all the things that are in the current news around Tesla and its growth trajectory.
I've been valuing Tesla since 2013, and I tell people that there isn't another company I've ever valued where I get so much backlash from both sides, no matter what my value is. Because the way I describe Tesla is there are no neutral investors in Tesla. Everybody has a point of view, and the point of view is extreme. There are some people who absolutely love Tesla, and let's face it, if you love Tesla, you love Elon Musk. The two are interchangeable. And that's something I want to talk about, is this is a personality-driven company. It is not a company that can survive without Elon Musk providing the oxygen. So the people who love the company, who believe that it's not just going to be the next trillion-dollar company, but it's going to be the greatest company of all time. That's one group. At the other extreme are people who are convinced that this whole thing is a scam, that Elon Musk is the P.T. Barnum of investing, and that this whole thing is going to come crashing down, and that Tesla is worth nothing. So here you have people think Tesla is worth trillions and Tesla is worth nothing. So if you come in with a value of 500 billion for Tesla, which is an incredibly lucrative value, the people who think it's worth trillions abuse you for coming up with too low a number. And the people who think it's worth nothing abuse you for coming up with too high a number. But I like valuing Tesla for a simple reason. It is the ultimate story stock. And I'll explain what I mean by a story stock. We think of investing in valuation as investing in a set of numbers. But the reality is, under every set of numbers, there's a story. The story can be a boring story. If you're valuing Kraft Heinz or Coca-Cola, this story is going to put you to sleep. There's not much you can tell that's going to make you get excited. It can be a horror story, which is what you would tell if you're valuing GE. There's no happy ending to the story. It's like watching one of those horror movies where the teenagers keep going down in the dark basement for all the wrong reasons and never coming back up. or it can be an uplifting story. Tesla is beyond all of those. It's a story that essentially keeps shifting on you. And Elon Musk is partly responsible. One moment you think you're valuing an automobile company, next moment you think you're valuing a boring company, as in boring under the ground. The third day you think you're valuing an energy company, a battery company. He keeps shifting the story on you, which also means that depending on the story you latch onto, you can come up with very different valuations of the company. Last year, the start of the year before COVID, I actually did a valuation, a do-it-yourself valuation of Tesla. And basically what I did was I let people pick their story for Tesla. I said, is Tesla an automobile company, a technology company, an energy company? And essentially at each stage of the story, I let them pick the pathway. And then I gave them a value for the company. And the values range from less than 50 billion to close to $1 trillion, depending on how you frame the story. So here's what I've learned with Tesla. I'm not going to go around telling other people they're crazy for buying Tesla, because there is a story, a plausible story you can get to that number. I wouldn't buy at that price, but that doesn't stop other people from doing it. And at the same time, if you're a person selling short on Tesla, please do so with the open mind of recognizing that the people on the other side are not crazy. In fact, I think one problem with the Tesla discussion is there's no discussion. People are so set in their ways that they don't even want to they're not open to the possibility that the other side might have a point.
Speaking of two sides of the story, and some people won't even listen, Bitcoin, and you take Elon Musk and other corporate, the MicroStrategy CEO, how do you see corporations investing in Bitcoin like Elon Musk, or just the whole Bitcoin valuation conversation or pricing, if you would?
Okay. I think the first thing is I hope Tesla remains an outlier on the Bitcoin. And this is exactly why I've described Tesla as my corporate teenager, because when I owned Tesla for a few months, I described it as a corporate teenager for a very simple reason. I mean, if you've had a teenager at home or remember when you were a teenager, you know what teenagers do. Every morning they wake up, they look in the mirror and they say, I have lots of potential. What can I do today to screw it all up? And Tesla does that every single day. I mean, why, if you're a company that everybody's celebrating is the greatest electric car company in the world, your market cap has gone to the hundreds of billions, you're the most valuable automobile company in the world, would you want to mess up your story by buying $2 billion worth of Bitcoin? What possessed you to do that? The problem with bringing Bitcoin into a company is you're now making a company, if a company is a story, Bitcoin is a different story. You're muddling your story as a consumer product company, as an electric car company by bringing in Bitcoin. But let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin. It's another investment that evokes strong reactions from both sides. Now, I describe Bitcoin as something that was invented by paranoids for paranoids. And people think of it as an insult, but it's actually a reality. Because if you think about the original paper that gave rise to Bitcoin, written by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is, as we've now learned, is a pseudonym. It could be that fat guy in Cleveland sitting in a basement room who calls himself Satoshi Nakamoto. But it was written in November of 2008. I don't know how many people in the audience were in the market in November of 2008, but I was. I remember what November 2008 felt like. The world was coming apart, right? Every institution was messing up. Regulators, governments, politicians, we had lost trust. Bitcoin was born out of that paranoia. And the structure of Bitcoin reflects that paranoia. It's built on the presumption you cannot trust anybody. No central banks, no centralized authority. But for the last 12 years, it's taken hold of our imagination completely out of proportion to its place in the global economy. And let me explain. Collectively, Bitcoin, now at its peak, is worth about $1.5 trillion, all cryptos put together, $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion sounds like a lot of money until you realize that one publicly traded company, Apple or Microsoft, is itself worth more than all of the cryptos put together. One company. we spend all this time worrying about cryptos. So I've been, in the last 12 years, one of the most common questions I've been asked is Bitcoin undervalued or overvalued? And at the risk of grave personal injury, I say, look, you cannot value Bitcoin. Why? Let's face it, if it's a currency, currencies cannot be valued. You cannot value the dollar, you cannot value the euro. You can come up with a price. That's what an exchange rate is. And that price is going to reflect how good or bad a currency is. A good currency will have a higher price, its exchange rate will go up. A bad currency will not. And the question is Bitcoin a good currency? And from my perspective, it's failed miserably as a currency. I mean, now I would challenge people in the audience to tell me when the last time they used Bitcoin on a transaction was. I'm not asking when the last time you traded Bitcoin, but when did you use Bitcoin to buy a house, buy a car, buy a cappuccino? If you're not using it as a currency, then it's not delivering as a currency. The other defense of Bitcoin, of course, is it's millennial gold. That if you're 35 years old and you panic, unlike your parents and your grandparents, you didn't buy gold, you're going to buy Bitcoin. Okay, fair story. But here's what gold has going for it: 5,000 years of history, of maintaining its value. How long has Bitcoin been around? 12 years. Would you want to take your pension fund and put it into Bitcoin and expect it to still be there 35 years from now? I wouldn't. Or 10 years from now. The problem for me is Bitcoin is a terrible currency and it hasn't proven its worth as a collectible. So why am I paying 50,000? I'm not. So maybe we should ask people who pay 50,000, what's your rationale? Because the problem with Bitcoin is it's held by people, I think, who are, and many of the people who are holding Bitcoin are holding one reason and one reason alone, which is they want to flip it to somebody else at a higher price. But they can't give me a good justification for why they paid the price that they did. And that's a dangerous place to be with any investment, including Bitcoin.
Okay. We'll see where Bitcoin goes. We'll have this conversation a year from now, but it'll be diverging. Having said that, the role of celebrities, how they've driven Bitcoin prices, but how celebrities are also driving SPAC prices, and the role in social media or celebrities in SPACs. How do you frame that out in terms of valuations or where the market is headed, Professor Damodaran?
It doesn't surprise me. Markets are composed of human beings, and everything we do in our regular lives are going to find their way into markets. Let's face it. We live in a world where Kylie Jenner is worth billions. For doing what? Because she's a celebrity, and we buy what she tells you to buy. And we do this on almost every aspect. We watch movies because a celebrity says that's a great movie. We live in a world where we worship or we follow celebrities in pretty much every other aspect of life, in what we wear, what we put on our faces, whether we get plastic surgery, who we vote for. Why would we think markets are any different? And I think what you're seeing is celebrities are finding their way into markets. You talked about SPACs, as many of you are probably aware. There's a SPAC that's been created to buy WeWork. WeWork 2, not WeWork 1, which is that complete disaster that Masa Son and Adam Newman thrust upon us. WeWork 2. It's being acquired by the owner of the Sacramento Kings. He's the founder, promoter of the SPAC. But one of the partners in the SPAC is Shaquille O'Neal. I love Shaq. Now, I listened to him on basketball, and he's a very funny guy. So if he did a Space Jam 3, I'd be willing to watch it. But I'm not getting my investing advice from Shaquille O'Neal. So you're saying, why have Shaq on board? Because if you want to sell, so let's suppose the SPAC does do that merger. One of the things they're hoping for is Shaq will go online on his Twitter account and say, buy the shares. And if you have 4 million followers, we're in a world where 4 million people go buy those shares. Look at what's happening to the Dogecoin. I don't even know what to pronounce it as. How Mark Cuban and Elon Musk can make it, double in price and halve in price with tweets. Welcome to the world of celebrity investing. I'm not sure it's a healthy world because we're following people who know nothing about investing into all kinds of places in investing. But I'm not surprised that that it's here. It was just a matter of time. And I think I worry a little bit about people following celebrities, but then I tell myself a fool and his money will soon be parted. So why should I get in the way? If people are going to listen to celebrities to invest, who am I to stop and say you shouldn't listen to Shaquille O'Neal? To be honest, he might be just as good as the market pundits you see on CNBC because they seem to be so terribly wrong in the first place. So maybe Shaq would be a better market advisor than listening to market strategists from Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or whoever you listen to on CNBC.
Wow. Speaking of celebrities, Warren Buffett, okay? Value investing, Warren Buffett. How do you place just value investing and that Graham Dodd framework in today's world, Professor Damodaran?
I think the healthiest thing, I tell people if you're defending value investing and use the word Warren Buffett or use the words Warren Buffett, you've already lost the argument. Because if your defense of value investing has to keep going back to Warren Buffett, then you know what that tells me, right? That's like, if I ask you how good are the Yankees and you keep talking about Mickey Mantle, come on, that was 60 years ago. It's time to let go. I want you to talk about Aaron Judge, and I want to talk about the players that you have on the team right now. So I think the problem with value investing is it married itself to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. It tied itself at the hip because it served it well to do so because they were successful investors. And now it's facing the consequences because I think we've done Warren Buffett a disservice by putting him on a pedestal, treating him like a god. The most impressive thing about Warren Buffett's investment success is that he accomplished it as a human being with all his weaknesses, all the frailties he brought into the investment process. He was able to overcome them and deliver returns. That's what made him special. And I think by treating him as a god, we've kind of diluted what he's done. So I think that value investing, and I've used these words before, and value investors don't like to hear it. I used them in a talk I gave in Omaha. I wasn't actually at the Berkshire Hathaway meetings, but I was actually talking to portfolio managers who come to the meeting. I said there are 3 R words I would use to describe value investing. It's rigid. It's got all these rules on what to buy. You can't buy stocks that traded above book value. You can't buy stocks with price earnings ratios greater than 10. You can't buy tech stocks. You can't buy growth stocks. You can't buy money losing stocks. It's like being a 6-year-old. You're told all the things you cannot do. It's extraordinarily rigid. It's very ritualistic. There's this dance you got to do as a value investor. You got to act like you've read security analysis. I've written some boring books, but Ben Graham was really boring. Try reading security analysis, and if you have trouble sleeping, you will sleep like a baby. You fall asleep in page 2. But you got to act like you've read the book and that you love reading the book. It's like the Bible. It's right next to your book. It's lots of rituals. And one of those rituals, of course, is every year you go to Omaha and you pray. You pray to the deities up on the pedestal, Buffett and Munger. And it's righteous. What drives me crazy about value investors is how they're convinced that they're the chosen people. They're the chosen investors. They do all the right things. And in their world, they're going to see just rewards. And anybody else or everybody else in the investment world is a sinner. Why? Because they don't see the world the way value investors do. Rigid, ritualistic, righteous. This is no way to succeed in investing. That's always been true with value investing. Now the facts have caught up with them. So will I shed any tears for the death of old-time value investing? No. It's time to put it to rest. And I hope that we retire Buffett and Munger to the annals of great investors of the past and stop acting as if they have the answers to every question we face today.
Okay. Wow. All right. So when you talk about just valuations, you talk about the three Ps. Tell me, just explain that again, just for the audience, the three Ps.
Yeah, if valuation, every valuation of a company is a story. I apply what I call the 3P test. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Now, it's possible basically is, somebody's done it somewhere before. And after Amazon's done what they have over the last 25 years, almost every story is possible. But once in a while, you will hear a story and say, that's an impossible story. That's a fairy tale. So is it possible? A very low threshold to me. Then I ask, is it plausible? Plausible requires something more tangible, something we can say, look, not only has somebody done something like this before, but this is why we look like that somebody. This is why we look like Amazon. And probable is an even steeper step because you got to show that what you're trying to do, you've tried somewhere. We tried it in the Bay Area and it worked and it succeeded. 80% of the people who bought our product came back. Is it possible, plausible, probable? In fact, I'll give you a very simple way in which you can think of the difference between the three words. It actually came from a question I asked in 2017. I was in Latin America, and I was doing a 3-city tour. First day I was in Sao Paulo, the second day in Santiago, Chile, and third day in Lima. And I was talking about stories and numbers and this 3P test. So first day I land up in Sao Paulo, 300 Brazilians in the audience, and I'm trying to think of a good way of explaining the difference between possible, plausible, and probable. So I start thinking, what is a topic I can pick with 300 Brazilians where every person in the room is going to have an opinion? The topic I picked was soccer. So this is 6 months before the last World Cup. I say, is it possible that Brazil will win the World Cup? You ask 300 Brazilians 6 months before a World Cup, is it possible that Brazil will win the World Cup? The answer is obvious. They said, of course it's possible. We won it 5 times before. Then I said, is it plausible that Brazil will win the World Cup? That required a little more thinking. In fact, I'll wager if I asked this question in December of 2014 with that same audience, there'd have been a lot of shakiness in the room because you remember in 2014, Brazil lost to Germany, one of the great shellackings of all time, 8-2. But by 2017, they were feeling pretty good. They said, we're second ranked in the world. We're a pretty good team. Yes, it's plausible. Then I said, is it probable that Brazil will win the World Cup? And now you could see the wheels go into motion. If Neymar stays healthy and he doesn't flip and flop and do what Neymar does on the pitch, if we're in the right group and we don't play this team, then it's probable. And I said, that's the way we need to think about founder stories. A founder tells a story, is it possible? And then you start asking questions, is it plausible? In fact, one of the things I suggest people do is they watch Shark Tank. My classes are fun. I don't ask them to do homework. I ask them to watch TV shows. And I said, watch it actively. When a founder gets up there and describes a business, I want you to think of 3 questions you would ask that founder to go from possible, plausible, probable. What are those 3 questions? Because that to me is what separates good business stories from fairy tales. So the next time you look at a company and you're saying, should I invest in Coinbase? Should I invest in Tesla? There's a story you can tell that justifies the price. The question you got to ask is that a possible story? Is that a plausible story? Is that a probable story? And you're very quickly going to see that the threshold for you to invest is going to shift.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So let's talk about some of your best stories where valuation meets, some of the best stories. So in that light, Professor Damodaran, give me one stock that would be your best 3-year hold and one stock would be your best 10-year hold.
Okay, I still own Uber. I actually bought Uber in September of 2019. I still think they're staggering towards a business model. They haven't arrived there yet. And I think you could tell a solid story for Uber. I mean, today the stock is down 6%, I think, because the Secretary of Labor suggested that Uber drivers should be treated as employees. That's a big deal for Uber. But in a strange way, doing that will make them stronger as a company because it'll make it more difficult for a startup ride-sharing company to even get off the ground, right? Because once this rule is passed, everybody faces that rule. So I would say if you're looking at growth companies, I would look at Uber. I like Peloton and Zoom as companies, but they're way too richly priced. These companies have big stories. The question is, can you get them at the right price? So the question is not whether you can find companies which have good stories, but whether you can get them at the right price. And in this market where everything is so richly priced, it's getting more and more difficult to find stories that you can get at a right price, because everything priced in seems to be priced in for perfection, that things will come in. And as we saw in 2020, the world is an unpredictable place. I mean, who at the start of 2020 could have seen the shutdown of the global economy 3 months later? And I think that it's amazing how quickly we've forgotten that event. And we're starting to build in the expectation that not only will it never happen again, but we're going to bounce back fully and more. Now, I do own a couple of airlines now, because if you're looking at stories, it's not a great business story, but the price is right. So if you look at, I own Southwest and Singapore Airlines in my portfolio, because I think there's among the airlines, I see them as more solid, and everything is relative. Airlines are all shaky, and these are the least shaky of the lot. And I do believe that the airline business is going to face some damage, but I think the damage is going to come in business travel more than in leisure travel. And part of the reason is, why would you fly 5 bankers from New York to London and pay $50,000 when you can do a Zoom session and accomplish exactly the same thing? That's what companies, I think, have learned, is there's too much business traveling to do too little. That often 80% of this travel you can dispense with. And that, I think, is going to be damaging for those airlines that depend more on business travel. To me, Southwest is less dependent on business travel than many of the other big airlines. So from that perspective, you can sift through the debris. I don't know what the equivalent cruise line company would be. I'm too terrified of the cruise line business to jump in. But if you can find in the debris a company that is an outlier, retailing, brick and mortar retailing has crashed and burned. The story's been written. There's no coming back. So when I hear talks about the return of Bed Bath & Beyond, I have to laugh, because where are they going to return to? Who in their right mind think there's a happy ending to the story? But there are retail companies that seem to have found a way to keep the online monster at bay, in particular Amazon. You look at Costco, you look at the dollars. I mean, basically, there are companies that seem to have found a niche in the brick and mortar retail business. So my suggestion is, if you're looking for good investments, look in sectors where people have given up, where they feel the future doesn't look good, and start finding companies that have created niches for themselves that are solid enough that they can get through the next big disruption, the big disturbance to the force.
Good. So tell me, during the pandemic, what's a new hobby or something that you changed or evolved into a hobby or something that inspired you, Professor Damodaran?
I'm a very boring person. I don't need much to keep myself occupied. So I've never much enjoyed big social occasions. So to me, this was a blessing. No reason to go to fancy dinners or meetings. So to be part of this it gave me more time to just ponder. I think, one of the things I tell people, because I constantly keep getting asked by people, what should I read? I have a lot of time on my hands. And I'm tempted to paraphrase Hamilton and say, read less, do more. Because we are, I think, in a world where there's so much that we can spend the time. Podcasts we can listen to, books we can read, that we've forgotten how to think for ourselves. And I think, in a sense, what the pandemic gave me a chance is, I used to take a walk down to the ocean with my dog, because the dog soothes my anxieties, I guess. Just sit on the bench, look at the ocean, and think about, hey, why is GameStop up at 400 today? Rather than read about somebody else's explanation. It's not like that I have some secret explanation, but it forces me to go back to what I know, use a framework that I'm comfortable with to try to come up with answers to questions that are out there. And I think that's a luxury that most of us, it's a luxury I have that most people don't. They have jobs, they have 10 hours of work every day, they have deals, they have deadlines. Now, one of my advantages, I have no deals, no deadlines. I don't do consulting. I don't do expert witness work. My time is my own, and I can spend it doing nothing and thinking about nothing. And I don't underestimate the power of just pondering about things that don't seem to matter that much. While we wait for Ron, if you want to step in, I think.
I'd be happy to. I don't want to steal Ron's thunder, but I'd be happy to.
I think we're towards a Q&A anyway. So from the audience, it's close to 9:40. So maybe we can transition to the Q&A, and if Ron is able to join us, then.
Okay. So let me. I just want to ask about one aspect of what you didn't talk about on Bitcoin, and then I'll go to the audience questions. NFTs. Mm-hmm. Where do you see them going? Do you see them as this is blockchain, not crypto?
I'll tell you the upbeat view of NFTs. Part of it looks like craziness. Why would I want to buy a 30-second clip of LeBron James slam dunking a ball that everybody else can watch for free? Now, why am I paying? And yesterday, there was a story of an NFT about this girl called the Disaster Girl. Did you see the story? It's about this girl who, she was 4 years old, was filmed in front of burning house, the house, and she was smiling, and it's actually been used over and over as a meme in lots of different roles. And that NFT sold for, I think, $500,000. But there's an embedded story there, which is this is a clip that people have used in ads, they've used it in, and if you own the rights to it, while other people can watch it on TV, they cannot use it for commercial purposes. So the potential, the way to treat an NFT as an asset is if you have an NFT that you can license out. I mean, imagine owning the NFT to the Zapruder film, the one on the front. I mean, that would be an incredibly valuable NFT because anytime a news source would run it. So people might be able to watch it online, but if ABC wants to run it, they have to pay you. I think then the value of the NFT will be the present value of the cash flows you can get from licensing out that NFT. So from that perspective, when I look at an NFT, the question I'm asking is there a potential that somebody can use this in advertising to make money? And if the answer is yes, I'm willing to consider what the cash flows are and come up with it. And $500,000 for the Disaster Girl might not be a bad investment to make because you need to make about $15,000, $20,000 in licensing. And let's see if that plays out. So I think part of me wants to dismiss NFT saying, who's crazy enough to buy a virtual clip? The other part has to stay open to the possibility that this is the world we live in. And people pay for digital images. I'm going to be willing to kind of pay for the rights to that image.
So that's actually an interesting answer. So would love to follow up with you at some point. Let me just turn to the first audience question and then hand it back to Ron. This is a question from a student of yours from last year, Jason Barnett. He says he took your online valuation certificate class last year. It was an amazing class, game changer for me. My question, should capital gains tax double? Is it possible for the cost of equity to decrease?
Okay. It's actually a good question. First, I mean, the proposal that's being talked about is kind of a skewed proposal. It's not going to double for everybody. It's going to double for a subset. But even if you double for a subset, here's how.
But that subset is some of the largest traders, right?
So basically, here's the way to think about capital gains taxes. When you think about equity risk premiums in markets, so right now it's about 4.5%. That equity risk premium is the return demanded by equity investors to meet their after-tax needs. So right now it's about 6 to 6.5% after taxes. And right now the tax rate is 20% for everybody. So if you take 6.5% on a pre-tax basis, that works out to what, 7.7, 7.8%. So right now pre-tax, investors are demanding 7.8%. So let's make this capital gains tax something that everybody faces. It's going to be 40% for everybody. I'll have to earn more pre-tax to end up at a 6% return, which effectively means if I hold everything else constant, an increase in the capital gains tax will have to push up my equity risk premium. There's no pathway to a lower cost of equity. It can. Will it push down the value of stocks? It depends on whether that money is going to pay off at some higher growth rate because I invest in infrastructure. So potentially, maybe you could tell a story of it leaves you neutral, that what you pay as a higher cost of equity is now going to be offset by a growth rate. But that, I think, is going to be a tricky wicket to make that growth assumption. So if you ask me, holding all of its constant, what will an increase in capital gains taxes do? It'll increase your equity risk premium, push up your cost of equity, and push down your value of equity. How much we can debate, because that's going to depend on how much bite there is in capital gains. Capital gains taxes are a terrible way to raise revenues, because I live in the state of California, and this is a state that's historically been very dependent on capital gains taxes, because it taxes capital gains at the ordinary state tax rate. So in years that the market does well, the California budget looks really good. Years that the market does badly, which is precisely when you want to be spending money as a government, the tax revenues collapse. You've made your tax revenues incredibly market sensitive. And I don't think that's a good idea to me, the reason you have a tax code is because you want to collect revenues. It's not a mechanism for punitive action or rewarding people, because this is how we get into trouble. We ornament our tax code with credits and deductions and punishments, and we end up undercutting our end game, which is we want to collect more in revenues from corporations. That's I think, an objective we should all share as taxpayers. What's the most effective way of doing this? And I'm not sure a capital gain tax rise is the way to do it for the long term.
Just one minor point of what you said. I agree with everything you said, except I don't think it's a bad idea for a state's revenues to be so market linked. What is the problem is when their expenditure is market linked, and when markets rise, they overcome it, as California did in '99 on the pensions front and other things. I think that's the real absence of discipline.
Well, we know with Congress that expenses are never going to match up to where you should be. So I take the expense side is going to be completely, it's not going to be rational in your lifetime or my lifetime. So at least let's make the revenue side a little more rational and less sensitive to market movements, because we make both sensitive to market movements, and we're going to get a double whammy, which is we're going to be looking at serious trouble on the next market downturn. And for those people who think that the next market downturn is never coming, this time is not different. Every market has a downturn. It's a question of when it comes, not whether it comes.
Mm-hmm. Ron, would you like to take back? Ron, would you like to take over the questions from the audience? I could continue with
I think Ron's audio is under assault from the Wi-Fi broadband.
Aswath, can you see the questions there?
Yeah.
Coming to my.
So let me follow up on your last question. So there are lots of people who ask you when actually there is a couple of questions at least on when the next crash is coming. But I'm going to switch to ESG investing. December
23rd of 2022. I'm just kidding. So I could make it. With when in doubt, add precision is my answer, right?
Yes. So. Yes. ESG investing.
Yeah.
So this is a question from Manish Somaya. What are your views on ESG investing? Is it having the impact as advertised? If not, what needs to change?
Do you really want to hear my views? It's going to make a lot of people unhappy. This is the most overhyped, oversold concept in the history of business. I mean, never have I seen a concept sold as cake for everybody, calories for no one. Now, I wrote a piece on ESG. In fact, I wrote a paper on ESG where the title of the paper is Sounding Good or Doing Good. And I'll give you, the reason I'm so cynical about ESG, I've heard, the people who promote ESG, and there are a lot of them out there. And many of them are institutional. The institutions have clearly bought in. Let's face it, BlackRock is one of the, Larry Fink is one of the biggest pushers of ESG. And I think he is, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in the sales pitch, but he's a big push. So the institutions are bought in, the CEOs are bought in, and it looks like everybody's on the boat, and this boat is leaving. But the problem, I think, with ESG is what I saw happen with corporate governance 30 years ago. As both you and I know, corporate governance became this big topic, and everybody talked about how critical it was that management be accountable to shareholders. We had a corporate governance bandwagon get created, and then people started to make money off corporate governance. You had consultants like McKinsey and BCG coming and doing value consulting. You had bankers who would go in and say, well, you want to increase value, here's what you need to do. And of course, you had the services that claim to measure corporate governance scores. And it's like business school rankings. Once you know what drives the scores, you learn to play the game much better. So companies learn to play the corporate governance game. A lot of people got rich from the corporate governance bandwagon, but none of them are shareholders in the companies that supposedly benefited from the corporate governance. If you ask me, is the quality of corporate governance now better than it was 30 years ago? My answer is absolutely not. Some of the largest companies in the world have found an easy way around corporate governance. They've created two classes of shares, something we did not see 30 years ago. So where is this corporate governance bandwagon been while the ground has been cut out from under them? And my fear is ESG is going down the same pathway. It's being built around services measuring ESG. And there's a fundamental problem here. You're trying to measure something where we have no consensus. We can have a consensus on what is profitable and what's not, but we cannot have a consensus on what is good, right? Your definition of good, my definition of good, it's a reflection of your culture, your age, your religion. I mean, all of those things go into being good, which is one reason the correlation across ESG measures, across different services, is very low. The same company shows up in the top 10% in some services and the bottom 10% in others. Classic example is Facebook. One service, Facebook, is ranked as one of the top companies in terms of ESG. Now, I'd guarantee there are people in the audience who think Facebook, Scott Galloway, for instance, if I asked him about Facebook, be very open about the fact that this is the most evil company in the face of the earth. I'm not agreeing with Scott or disagreeing with him, but I'm pointing out that ESG measures are going to be fun. And this is not something you're going to get over. You're not going to grow out of it. It's going to be fundamentally problematic because it depends on what you value the most. Is it climate change? Is it privacy? And then if you go to the next step and say ESG increases value, now we're in a domain where I feel comfortable because I know what drives value. It's cash flows, growth, and risk. So if you're claiming that ESG will make me a more valuable firm, let's get more tangible. Will it give me higher cash flows? Will more people buy my product? Maybe if you're Patagonia, you can claim that being a good company, you're selling more, having higher margins.
It's good business.
But you can't scale up. Patagonia has revenues less than $1 billion. Of course, it can afford to be a good company. Can Nike afford to pull off? I don't think so. What it forces you to do when you're tangible is it forces you to realize that ESG will increase value for some companies, do nothing for value for some, and actually reduce value for others. And that's the place of honesty we've got to begin with, is being good is not free. And if you're an investor and you want to be good, and of course, we live in universities, we live in a world of endowment funds where we signal our virtues by who we invest in. I'm okay with you saying, look, I don't want to invest in bad companies. But then don't turn around and say, I also want to earn a higher return. I remember enough of my operations research class to recognize that a constrained optimal can never deliver a higher return than an unconstrained optimal. So don't tell me that if you remove 30% of the universe, that somehow you can get higher returns. So my problem with ESG is we need more honesty if we want this to stick. We need to be honest about the fact that some companies will be hurt when they try to be good, that some investors or many investors have to accept lower returns by putting a good company constraint, and that society overall is going to benefit only if companies act good, not talk good or say. And I think what we're giving companies is cover by creating these scores. They'll have a checkbox and they'll go through the checkboxes. They'll score high on ESG, but nothing is going to change. So I think we have the shared objective. We want companies to be good. I'm not sure the way we're going is going to deliver on that.
So let me go back to capital gains for a second, and I'm going to come back to what you just said for the next and possibly last question. I'm going back to capital gains for a second. This is a question from our alumnus Ricardo Dado. Ricardo asks, will the passing of the Biden-led capital gains tax increase the likelihood of a correction? And if so, how differentially would it impact pricey stocks versus non-pricey ones?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think corrections are precipitated in my experience, corrections never happen because of a big event. They happen because of a collection of small cuts. When you think about 2001, that correction didn't happen because something happened in March of 2001 where everybody woke up. It's a series of small cuts. So will it be the tax cut itself passing? I don't think so. It'll be other things along the way that remind you that you're in crazy town, that you're doing things you shouldn't be doing.
Cut.
No. So so I think that so I think that it really is going to be a collection of small things, each of which you look and say that makes no sense. That makes no sense. There's a tipping point here where collectively things that don't make sense pile up to the point where you say there's going to be a correction. So and that's why corrections are so difficult to forecast. That's why I'm not a market timer. I believe the market is too richly priced. I think there's going to be a correction, but I don't adjust my portfolio to reflect that because I don't know whether the correction will happen in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or 2 years, and I don't know what's going to precipitate it. So I think that, linking big events with market movements makes us feel like we're in control, but unfortunately, that's not the way markets tend to work. So I think that, if you ask me to guess as well, I don't think you're going to see the doubling of the capital gains tax rate. I think you're going to end up with maybe a 28% capital, because people recognize that it can actually become counterproductive from a revenue basis to raise the tax rate to 43, because the predictable consequence is you're going to get a ton of selling towards the end of the year. People are going to lock in at 20% and then hibernate.
Mm-hmm.
No. So I think that raising the capital gains tax rate too high actually will reduce revenues. It's like a reverse Lafleur curve or a Lafleur curve kicking in, at least with capital gains taxes.
Yeah. So the thing I want to go back to for a second, this is the last question. I would love to go on with this a little longer, but unfortunately I have another reunion event at 1:00 to introduce somebody. So we need to be done at least a minute before then. So this question is from Nikhil Hathi Singh, MBA class of 1992. In a world where celebrities and stories drive stocks, how wise is it for an individual to invest purely on a stock's intrinsic value?
It's a good question. I think it's a good question, because when you're an investor, you invest based on value. You're also investing on the belief that price will adjust to value. I described in my valuation class, I said, look, investing is an act of faith in your value and faith that price will adjust to value. And when you live in a world where price can deviate from value by large amounts and stay there for an extended period, it means that you could wait a long time for the adjustment, and you might not be around by the time the adjustment actually does happen. It does make it more dangerous to play that game, especially if you pick 3 or 4 stocks. You know what? If nothing else, whenever I'm faced with uncertainty, my biggest defense is the law of large numbers, which is, hey, don't invest in your 3 most undervalued stocks, pick your 20 most undervalued stocks. And in this world, when I hear people talking about why you shouldn't diversify, I heard Mark Cuban say the other day on some kind of interview that's crazy that people diversify, that if you truly believe in your investing, you should buy only 4 or 5 stocks. And Charlie Munger said the same thing a few weeks ago. It just shows you that people you think are smart can say really stupid things. And I think that's a really stupid piece of advice to give investors, to put all your money in Zoom, Peloton, and Bitcoin, and then go to sleep. You might never wake up from that sleep because all you need is a massive correction in one and the whole thing can blow up on you. So my answer to uncertainty is to not run away from investing bases, but to spread my bets. Spread my bets across markets, across stocks, across sectors. And that's, I think, the only defense you can have. And you still need time to be your ally. So if you're only 3 months before you retire and you need every dollar in your portfolio, for God's sakes, don't go and be an intrinsic value investor. You shouldn't have been starting 5 years ago, but if you're still there, this is your time to cash. Now, I'll make this personal. With each of my kids, I've managed their portfolios, partly because they were too young then, but when they got to be 18, I gave them a choice. Do you want to? And they've left me partly because they pay me nothing. And one of the things I gradually do for them is when I manage their portfolios when they were kids, I used to buy individual stocks, the same stocks I bought for my portfolio. And starting at the age of 18, I've started moving them out of individual stocks into index funds, which are more passive, for a couple of reasons. Investing in individual stocks is more time and resource intensive than funds. I've got to watch the stock. I've got to sell it when it gets too high. It's more tax. So it costs me more in taxes. It costs me more in transactions costs. And I don't want them to bear that burden going forward because they have lives to live. They're not investors. They have jobs to do. So I moved them out of stocks and funds. And that's something that I think investors who find themselves frustrated with individual stocks should increasingly think about. It's not an admission of failure or weakness to say, look, I have a life to live. I don't want to be spending 4 hours a day tracking my stocks and worrying about them. I'm essentially going to buy funds, and with ETFs and index funds, you can pretty much create whatever you want in your portfolio and then go back to living your lives.
Thank you, Aswath. We're out of time, but as always, it's been a tremendous pleasure. And I would love to have had the time to follow up on some of the things, passive investing, for example, which you just spoke about, diversification, all these other things. But look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully in the fall this year. Stay well, be well.
I will. Take care. Yeah.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the internet problems, but thank you so much for driving up and at least trying your best to make this work. And I'm sorry I had to step in halfway, but look forward to seeing you at our board meeting. And thank you so much again for participating in this session.
And thank you for your leadership. And thank you, Professor Damodaran. It was great.
Thank you.
Talking.
Take care.
To everyone in the audience, I just want to thank you for attending. We will send the list of questions that were submitted to Aswath, and if he has the time, he will respond to each of you. We'll send those of you who submitted names, he will respond to you directly. Okay, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you in person at an alumni reunion sometime soon. Bye-bye.